So to say that COVID-19 pandemic has changed the world would be an understatement. It has changed how we work, how we learn, how we interact with one another. Unsurprisingly, the pandemic has not just triggered waves, but even shed light on mental health issues. Whether it's managing depression, social isolation, or just the general stress and anxiety that's resulted from COVID-19 and the ongoing aftermath. Before we progress with the discussion, let's go over the definition of mental well-being as established by the World Health Organization. So they have defined it as a state of mental health in which an individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to contribute to his or her community. When we speak about community, we talk about friends, family, and more importantly, the workplace. So, now let's have a look at some data on mental health in the past years, right? Even before the pandemic in 2020, research and studies have already shown mental health from 2004 to 2019. In the Philippines alone, according to the Department of Health, 3.3 million Filipinos live with depressive disorders. There is a scarcity of mental health professionals in the Philippines. The ratio is actually one of the lowest in Asia, or even the world. It's 0.2 mental health professionals per 100,000 residents. In Singapore, 1 in 7 adults have experienced a mental health condition in their lifetime, according to a 2018 national survey. And it is estimated that about 18% of Singapore's youth experience some form of depressive disorder. They have 2.8 mental health professionals per 100,000 residents, which is a lot less compared to Australia, where we have 13.5 mental health professionals per 100,000 residents. In Malaysia, it was determined by a national survey in 2020 by the Ministry of Health that 1 in 3 adults have a mental health condition. There are 1.27 mental health professionals per 100,000 residents. In Indonesia, one of the biggest and most populous countries in the world, 9 million suffer from depression, and there's only 0.3 mental health professionals per 100,000 residents. According to WHO, in 2019, India accounted for nearly 15% of the global mental, neurological health challenges in the world, and this is even before the pandemic. So similar to Indonesia, the ratio is pretty small, 0.3 mental health professionals per 100,000 residents. Across Asia Pacific, 19.20%, a cross-sectional study have shown, across Asia for all countries, the major depressive disorder prevalence, this is the percentage increase, right? And according to Mercer, 50% of global employees, this could include you and me, are stressed, right? And several of the top surveyed countries reporting to have above our average actually come from Asia. So a lot of us are pretty stressed out. I think HR professionals are some of the most stressed out professionals in the world. I think we can all agree on that. All right, Talent, LMS, and Bamboo HR. I think we're all familiar with these HRIS apps, right? Surveyed thousands of Gen Zs in the workplace, and 82% deem mental health days are important. We'll talk more about this, and I think we have another speaker who has that specific topic in mind. And next is a study conducted by Deloitte in 2022 of Gen Zs in the workplace state that 39% are concerned about how their mental well-being is prioritized by the organization they work with, mentioning flexibility and creativity as top 2 components that they want to look for. So as we've established with these daunting numbers, right, addressing and focusing on mental well-being is not just a nice to have, it's a must, right? So as HR leaders, we also need to assess whether our organizations have all of these types of mental health agendas in place in our workplaces. And if it isn't in place, we need to start having those conversations with our organizations. So as members of HR, how do we ascertain that we're actually putting this as a priority? So before we get into solution mode, let's delve into another challenge that our employees face when it comes to mental health. I think this is not just true for our workplaces, but also true for our daily lives. It is the stigma that comes with it, right? So in a recent Global Mental Health Index review conducted by the Canadian group LifeWorks, it states that there is a prevalent stigma around mental health and its related issues such as depression, anxiety, and fatigue. This is not only common in Asia, it's actually a global concern. So we look at the stigma in 3 areas. The very first one is caused by our family orientation, our communities, our tribes, our cultural backgrounds, and the social expectations that come along with it. For instance, do you feel that your friends or your family members would view you differently if you admit to them that you have a mental challenge, right? So that is what we call a social stigma. The second one is what we call a self-stigma. And this is where you internalize some of the things that you might hear from society. Even if you yourself don't feel that you would be stigmatizing others, it is a very real phenomenon where people feel more badly about themselves if they have a mental health issue. They feel ashamed about it, right? It's something that you feel you have to keep a secret, you can't tell or talk to people about. They have emotions on disappointment, inadequacy, and failure. This is very strong, especially in our culture as Asians. And the third one is actually the workplace stigma, right? Where you feel that your career prospects would be compromised if you speak about your mental challenges at work. You may feel that you will be prevented from getting a promotion or having been assigned projects that are more challenging, right? So due to the social stigma and costs that surround the topic of mental disorders, most people who suffer from mental health do not ask or receive treatment for it. And without proper treatment, people are forced to deal with these issues alone, leading them further into a vicious cycle of stress and despair. As most of the world has switched into a remote work setup, I think some of us are still in that kind of hybrid work model. It's very challenging for us as HR members to assess whether our employees are actually struggling in terms of their mental health. Now, before we move on to the solution mode, let's talk about some of the ramifications of mental health that lead to indirect relationship and work performance issues at work. So the lack of understanding could mean that our employees are suffering in silence without any possible avenues of support. The very same that may take all the difference in getting them started on better mental care and management. Instead, this lack of support would show up in more tangible ways, like higher rates of absenteeism, presenteeism, attrition, and even poorer overall ROI. So let's talk about the first one. So mental health problems are currently the leading cause of absenteeism. As the frequency of employees' attendance drops, so does the responsibility and capability in contributing productively for the company. This means that employees are likely to face greater tangible losses in terms of their company's overall performance. Presenteeism. So a lot of you might be doing this yourselves. As you may already know, presenteeism refers to the misconception that work attendance equals productivity. Companies with this point of view tend to believe that their best employees are those who work the longest hours, those who leave last in the workplace, and those that also come to the office even if they're sick. It's like a badge of honor. You're going to the office feeling sick, but you're there because I'm what they call it, the hero of the story, right? So this is what we call presenteeism. It is combined with the fear of losing face when it comes to acknowledging existing mental health conditions. Employees are led to believe that their jobs and reputation will be on the line should they attempt to seek help or practice self-care. And then we now come up with attrition. The prolonged perpetuation of mental health stigma in the workplace can also lead to high staff attrition rates. For employees who live with existing mental health conditions, having to deal with the stresses of working life while facing mental health stigma at work could be the catalyst that forces them to resign. I think since we're all in HR, we all know that there is a corresponding numeric data on what happens when attrition is occurring in the workplace. But research has shown that replacing staff who leave their jobs can result in significant costs of up to 33% of an employee's annual salary. So that's quite a huge number. Thus far, we have focused on the negative effects of mental health stigma in the workplace. On the flip side, cost-benefit research has shown that there are net benefits to be gained by companies who invest in mental health programs and support, which deprioritize destigmatizing mental health. A recent World Health Organization-led study estimates that depression and anxiety disorders cost the global economy $1 trillion each year in lost productivity. Beyond showing a clear need for greater expenditure for proper mental health support, the results say that there is a huge improvement in productivity. So as we talk about mental health in the workplace and as HR leaders, we should also take note that approaching mental well-being is never a blanket approach, right? So it's not we all roll out our EAP programs. We all roll out a certain type of maybe a mental health app or a certain type of benefit. However, we need to assess first how our employees feel, what works for them. It has to be personalized. It has to be a fanged approach. If you're not familiar with the fanged approach, the Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google applications, what do they have in common? It's the personalized way of doing things. So this is also the best approach when we are looking about mental well-being. We cannot just roll out a certain type of program. We need to assess what works best for each of the employees. Also, this is everyone's business. It's not just HR, right? So it's key that we get the buy-in of all our stakeholders. Get the leaders of the organization to have these conversations and get their buy-in to support it. If your leaders are not talking about mental well-being, then there is definitely something wrong in the organization, because it is definitely one of the things we should prioritize moving forward. And if it's not happening in the level of the leadership, we as HR should be the catalyst to make this happen. Start having those conversations with those leaders and tell them and ask them to enable the mental well-being agenda in your workplaces. Because why do we need to do that? Because it's important to note that the mental well-being agenda is not a facade or a face or just a ramification of COVID-19. Mental well-being has always been something we should be prioritizing even without COVID-19. It's only been highlighted that there is a need to address it when the pandemic hit. So make sure that that call to action is happening in your organizations. As HR and as leaders, we need to champion our workplace well-being. So how do we actually do this in a more effective way? Later on, we'll talk about several types of solution modes. However, I want to take this opportunity to let everyone know that one of the most effective ways to do this right away is to practice vulnerability. So as you all know, in HR, no one has ever gone through the pandemic. No HR team or HR professional has a playbook or a toolkit on how to deal with the pandemic. All of us, right? Every single person in this room, it was our first time to deal with the pandemic while managing the workplace and managing the well-being of our employees. So this is one of the critical things that we need to take note of. Okay. And so how can we sustainably provide mental well-being in the workplace as HR and leaders of our organization? One of the first things we can do is enable our organization to accept, recognize, and focus on mental health awareness to destigmatize seeking support. So normalize those conversations between you and your leaders. Also enable them to practice vulnerability. So it's really important that we don't just say that this is a nice to have, but it's definitely a must have and should always be part of our strategy.
Embed mental well-being in the organizational strategy. We all create values in the workplace, right? Values, processes, policies. Always make sure that you account for the mental well-being component. When you create values, how do we ascertain that they enable mental well-being? So we need to take a look at flexible work policy. How do we build safe spaces for our employees? How do we ascertain that our culture, our work culture, has the mental well-being focus embedded into it? Also, we need to enable our workplace itself, the tangibles, to support mental well-being. When we talk about mental well-being, it's not just the mental capacity, but also the overall, as I've defined earlier. So we need to make sure that we have collaborative workspaces, quiet areas, places in our workplace that also support our employees with disabilities. So all of them are able to bring their best selves to their workplace. They should be able to feel safe, seeking help and having those conversations, not just with you, but with their managers and their colleagues. And enable our leaders, people managers, and HR teams to manage mental well-being effectively. The thing is, you cannot pour from an empty cup. So if you yourself are having challenges mentally, then you should seek help yourself. And you should not be ashamed that I'm in HR, I can't be having mental health issues. No, we're all human beings. So in order for you to be effective, in order for your leaders to be effective in the workplace, you need to be able to seek help. You need to be able to have those conversations yourselves. And then you can be more effective in supporting each of your employees. Now that we've talked about the definition of mental well-being, facts about mental health, and numbers in the world, the mental health stigma and its impact in the workplace, and how we can provide mental well-being, I'd like to leave you all with one of the quotes from Nido Chubin, and I thought that it is very apt, right, on how we can manage our own mental well-being. Your present circumstances don't determine where you go. They merely determine where you start. So we've shared insights on how we can better support our employees or leaders in our organization. However, we must never ever forget that it is important to recognize whether we need support ourselves. And if we do, it's even more critical that we know how to seek support. It's interesting that because HR, we always look after everyone else. Who's looking after you? So who's looking after one another, right? So we always need to remember that. As we continue to support the mental health of our communities, let's also be mindful to not forget to reach out if we need support ourselves. So thank you all for your time today, and have a meaningful summer.